Who is Saturnino? This from the book Cuban Anarchism, The History of a Movement by Frank Fernandez. At about this time, the young Asturian, Saturnino Martinez, arrived in Cuba and went to work in the tobacco industry. He quickly became involved in the tobacco workers' associations and by the end of 1865 had founded the first workers' weekly paper in Havana, La Aurora, in which he outlined some of Proudhon's ideas, which the mechanical engineer José de Jesus Marquez had introduced to him. It was in La Aurora, not coincidentally, that Marquez proposed for the first time in Cuba the idea of cooperative societies. Martinez, although influenced by Proudhon's ideas of federation and mutual aid, was not an anarchist, and his proposals regarding the organization of work in the tobacco industry, which he purported to represent, were not really revolutionary. His paper, La Aurora, even though in favor of workers' associations, saw its primary mission as that of education, that of helping the Cuban Spanish workers develop intellectually. La Aurora defended the right of workers to free association, but this was the same position as that of the Partido Reformista, which indeed owned the press on which La Aurora was printed. Nonetheless, La Aurora was Cuba's first workers' newspaper, and Martinez took the first step toward the protection of workers' associations. He also initiated the practice of reading aloud in tobacco workshops, a practice which would have great utility in propagating anarchist ideas among tobacco workers in years to come. I first heard of Saturnino Martinez when I was reading this book about Cuban anarchism. Later, I became interested in the history of reading itself, which led me to find this book by Alberto Mangel called A History of Reading. And in that book, Mangel also references the story of Saturnino Martinez. Here I read from that book. I didn't know then that the art of reading out loud had a long and itinerant history, and that over a century ago, in Spanish Cuba, it had established itself as an institution within the earth-bound strictures of the Cuban economy. Cigar making had been one of Cuba's main industries since the 17th century, but in the 1850s, the economic climate changed. The saturation of the American market, rising unemployment, and the cholera epidemic of 1855 convinced many workers that the creation of a union was necessary to improve their conditions. In 1857, a mutual aid society of honest workers and day laborers was founded for the benefit of white cigar makers only. A similar mutual aid society was founded for free black workers in 1858. These were the first Cuban workers' unions and the precursors of the Cuban labor movement of the turn of the century. In 1865, Saturnino Martinez, cigar maker and poet, conceived the idea of publishing a newspaper for the workers in the cigar industry, which would contain not only political features, but also articles on science and literature, poems and short stories. With the support of several Cuban intellectuals, Martinez brought out the first issue of La Aurora on October 22nd of that year. Its purpose, he announced in the first editorial, will be to illuminate in every possible way that class of society to which it is dedicated. We will do everything to make ourselves generally accepted. If we are not successful, the blame will lie in our insufficiency, not in our lack of will. Over the years, La Aurora published work by the major Cuban writers of the day, as well as translations of European authors such as Schiller and Chateaubriand, reviews of books and plays, and exposés of the tyranny of factory owners and of the workers' sufferings. Do you know, it asked its readers on June 27, 1866, that at the edge of La Zanja, according to what people say, there is a factory owner who puts shackles on the children he uses as apprentices? But as Martinez soon realized, illiteracy was the obvious stumbling block to make La Aurora truly popular. In the mid-19th century, barely 15% of the working population of Cuba could read. In order to make the paper accessible to all workers, he hit on the idea of a public reader. He approached the director of the Juanabacoa High School and suggested that the school assist readings in the working place. Full of enthusiasm, the director met with the workers of the factory El Figaro and, after obtaining the owners of permission, convinced them of the usefulness of the enterprise. One of the workers was chosen as the reader, the official lector, and the others paid for his efforts out of their own pockets. On January 7, 1866, La Aurora reported, "Reading in the shops has begun for the first time among us, and the initiative belongs to the honored workers of El Figaro." This constitutes a giant step in the march of progress and the general advance of the workers, since in this way they will gradually become familiar with books, the source of everlasting friendship and great entertainment. Among the books read were the historical compendium, Battles of the Century, didactic novels such as The King of the World, by the now long forgotten Fernandez y Gonzalez, and a manual of political economy by Flores y Estrada. Eventually, other factories followed the example of El Figaro. So successful were these public readings that in very little time they acquired a reputation for being subversive. On May 14, 1866, the political governor of Cuba issued the following edict. "It is forbidden to distract the workers of the tobacco shops, workshops, and shops of all kinds with the reading of books and newspapers, or with discussions foreign to the work in which they were engaged. The police shall exercise constant vigilance to enforce this decree, and put at the disposal of my authority those shop owners, representatives, or managers who disobey this mandate, so that they may be judged by the law according to the gravity of the case." In spite of the prohibition, clandestine readings still took place for a time, in some form or other. However, by 1870 they had virtually disappeared. In October 1868, with the outbreak of the 10 Years' War, La Aurora too came to an end. And yet the readings were not forgotten. As early as 1869, they were resurrected on American soil by the workers themselves. The 10 Years' War of Independence began on October 10, 1868, when a Cuban landowner, Carlos Manuel de Céspedes, and 200 poorly armed men took over the city of Santiago and proclaimed the country's independence from Spain. By the end of the month, after Céspedes had offered to free all slaves joining the revolution, his army had recruited 12,000 volunteers. In April the following year, Céspedes was elected president of the new revolutionary government, but Spain held strong. 4 years later, Céspedes was deposed in absentia by a Cuban tribunal, and in March 1874 he was trapped and shot by Spanish soldiers. In the meantime, anxious to disrupt Spain's restrictive trade measures, the government had loudly supported the revolutionaries, and New York, New Orleans, and Key West had opened their ports to thousands of fleeing Cubans. As a result, Key West was transformed in a few years from a small fishing village into a major cigar-producing community, the new Havana cigar capital of the world. The workers who immigrated to the United States took with them, among other things, the institution of the lector. An illustration in the American Practical Magazine of 1873 shows one such lector, wearing glasses and a large-brimmed hat, sitting with legs crossed and a book in his hand, while a row of workers, all male, in waistcoats and shirt sleeves, go about their cigar rolling with what appears to be rapt attention. The material for these readings, agreed upon in advance by the workers, who, as in the days of El Figaro, paid the lector out of their own earnings, ranged from political tracts and histories to novels and collections of poetry, both modern and classical. They had their favorites. Alexandre Dumas's The Count of Monte Cristo, for instance, became such a popular choice that a group of workers wrote to the author shortly before his death in 1870, asking him to lend the name of his hero to one of their cigars. Dumas consented. According to Mario Sanchez, a Key West painter who in 1991 could still recall lectores reading to the cigar rollers in the late 20s, the readings took place in concentrated silence, and comments or questions were not allowed until the session was over. My father, Sanchez reminisced, was the reader in the Eduardo Hidalgo Gato cigar factory in the early 1900s until the 1920s. In the mornings, he read the news, which he translated from the local newspaper. He read international news directly from Cuban newspapers, brought daily by boat from Havana. From noon until 3 in the afternoons, he read from a novel. He was expected to interpret the characters by imitating their voices, like an actor. Workers who had spent several years at the pawn shops were able to quote from memory long passages of poetry and even prose. Sanchez mentioned one man who was able to remember the entire Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. Being read to, as the cigar workers found out, allowed them to overlay the mechanical, mind-numbing activity of rolling the dark-scented tobacco leaves with adventures to follow, ideas to consider, reflections to make theirs. We don't know whether in the long workshop hours they regretted that the rest of their body was excluded from the reading ritual. We don't know if the fingers of those who could read longed for a page to turn, a line to follow. We don't know if those who never had to read were prompted to do so. So there it is, Saturnino Martinez, the inspiration to my name for this channel. Anytime that I encounter something out there in the world, I have a passage for it that I would like to share and read aloud to you, so that while you may be driving, waiting for the red light to change to green, I would like to give you something to be able to think about and imagine as I read. I will be choosing different excerpts from different books depending on what the topic is. I hope you enjoy it. This in the name of Saturnino Martinez.